some of you have come to the Oriental Institute for the Kipper dinners, and my husband was very good friends with Gil and on the visiting committee. And that was also thanks to Maury, who then after David's death got me involved in doing a lecture in David's honor, which has been a pleasure. But I loved the Oriental Institute. I can't say I did at the beginning. It had a reputation that wasn't very welcoming to Jewish history. And one of the reasons it was important to have the David Kipper Ancient Israel series was to have that presence front and center. And I'm very thrilled that Gil and Maury encouraged me to do that. I am so in awe of what Gil is doing, because I remember when the Buddhas were destroyed, it was Asia Week in New York, and people basically couldn't talk. They were so appalled and in such pain. So Gil's trying to save and restore what can be saved and restored. So I'm dying to hear what he's been up to. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. I should just add that Barbara and David also helped us to set up, again, with Maury, Fred acting as the kind of the matchmaker.
Profession now.
Right. Yes, but it was not. It was not a forced marriage. It was.
No.
They set up the Kipper Family Archaeological Discovery Center, which was another real step forward for the Oriental Institute in reaching out to teaching children about archaeology and teaching it to them as what it is, which is a combination of the humanities and the sciences. And so it's the first interactive children's program that we've ever really had built into the Oriental Institute's museum educational mission. And I'm going to be talking about museum education stuff a little later in this talk. And but it's been a really wonderful addition. This simulated archaeological tell that we basically adopted from the Spertus Museum when they closed down their exhibit. We said, "Oh, we'll take it on," and so that became the Kipper Archaeological.
I love that it's a rollout tell to do a dig. It's been salted, and other times it's teacher training, so you can have a tell to dig in, then you can teach teachers.
Yeah. It's sort of like a Murphy bed that it folds
up. It is perfect. I was looking for a description. Yeah.
But no, really, thank you very much, because it's a unique thing and it's really good, and kids really respond to it. So anyway, so that's general background. I should just sort of briefly, introduce myself and sort of how I came to do all this. Some of you, know me pretty well, and others of you may not. But I'm an archaeologist, and my background, my PhD is in anthropology, and I've been working in the Middle East for most of my career. In Turkey, in Syria, and in Iraq. I was working in Syria when ISIS captured Raqqa, where I was digging, and so I moved to Iraqi Kurdistan in northeastern Iraq. And in all of it, I was studying the origins of the first urban societies in the Middle East. But I'd always tried to do it very much as, an objective scientist or social scientist. And And I'd always tried to keep what I was doing very apolitical. But in 2000 and I guess it was three with the, well, 2001 with the looting of the Bamyan Buddhas, I was really horrified. And then in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq and the Baghdad Museum was looted, I realized that we can't stay on the sidelines anymore, and that we really have to become active to preserve cultural heritage. And there's no escaping it, that it's our ethical and professional responsibility to be as active as we possibly can to preserve cultural heritage. So since that time, I've basically had a kind of uh, uh, two sides of me. One is continuing to do archaeological research in the central Middle East, but I also started working in Afghanistan to preserve cultural heritage. And now I'm working in Central Asia as well, in the 5 post-Soviet republics, or the Stans. And basically, to persuade my colleagues at the Oriental Institute, some of whom are very parochial in their outlook, and they, like, they're people who believe anything that's not Egypt isn't the Near East or the Middle East. And so I came up with what I call Gill's Persian principle, which is, if it was part of the Persian Empire, it's okay for us to work there. And of course, Afghanistan was part of the Persian Empire. It was one of the richest satrapies. Bactria was one of the richest satrapies in the Persian Empire. So I feel like that ought to be good enough for my colleagues. And so what I want to do today, let me open up the PowerPoint and see if I can get this running. How is that? Can everyone see
Yep.
that?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to switch to slideshow. All right. So what I'd like to do today is to really try and talk about big issues and how we can approach those big issues. And the topic that really is become a central focus of what I do is cultural heritage preservation. So I want to start by talking about this global cultural heritage crisis. And then I want to shift to Afghanistan as a place where we've been working, the University of Chicago has been working, and a place where if you can preserve heritage in Afghanistan, you can pretty much preserve it anywhere. But what I want to show you, and I hope I can persuade you of this, is that as horrible as the news is about this heritage crisis, there are still things that we as citizens can do. And I think they're very real, concrete things where we can make a difference. So I want to walk you through the projects that I've been doing in Afghanistan as examples of the different ways that we can preserve heritage. And then finally, I want to bring it around to, well, how can we broaden this model? How can we go from seeing kinds of things that work in Afghanistan to the kinds of things that we might be able to do at a global level, just way beyond Afghanistan, in both the developing world and the developed world, to preserve heritage. And then, so I'll be talking about this new center called the Chicago Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation that the University of Chicago recently established, and they asked me to be its founding director. So that's sort of the plan of what I hope to talk about. So most of you probably will know this, but basically, cultural heritage is one of these things that it's a term that's very widely used, and I sort of took the definition that UNESCO uses and tweaked it just a little bit. So I view cultural heritage as the legacy of physical artifacts and intangible attributes of a society that are inherited from the past, that people maintain in the present, and that they preserve for the benefit of future generations. And I see it as the glue that binds together communities and nations through a shared history and identity. And it's important to remember that cultural heritage is not only material things, which is basically most of what I do is tangible heritage, things like objects, monuments, or sites, but there's also an extremely important part of it that we would call intangible heritage, which is things like language, art, traditional crafts, dance, literature, and shared traditional knowledge. So cultural heritage has those two aspects. Oops, now what's happening now? Should be oh, there we go. Now, heritage right now is more at risk than at any time in history, and there are basically four main things that are risking and devastating cultural heritage. And the first two are the ones that get the headlines, and that is war or conflict, like we've seen in Iraq and Syria with the rise of ISIS, or the Taliban in Afghanistan. So war it's a factor, a very important factor, and it's one that grabs the headlines. And the other one that is very much in the public spotlight is looting for the international art market. But it's really important to remember that the sort of the silent killers of cultural heritage are actually at a much, much larger and more pervasive scale. And that's the massive population growth around the world, and connected with that, the huge expansion of cities with to house those populations. And what you're looking at in that bottom left is the citadel of Erbil in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan in northeastern Iraq. It's one of the oldest cities in the world, and it's got this enormous citadel. Yeah.
A lot of people are having problems not seeing the slideshow. I've gotten a couple of questions.
Oh no. Do you want, let me see, should I stop the share and then start it again? Should we try that?
Let's,
I can see it.
I can see it.
I don't think it's a problem from your end. There were some weird things to click on Zoom to get the slideshow this time. It isn't quite what I recognize, but I absolutely see the slideshow.
oh, didn't Zoom kind of improve security? So this is probably it.
I don't know. I mean,
I had to upgrade right before getting on, actually, Barbara. So yeah. But can everyone see it now? That's the main question.
Yeah.
I can.
All right, good. So anyway, can you see
Alexander, can you?
There's no volume.
Can you see it?
No, I can't. I'm not sure what I need to click, whether, I mean, I haven't.
Try messing around with the view dot up in your upper
yeah,
right-hand corner.
where it says view options.
Yeah.
Click
you.
on
Thank you.
Problem solved?
Yes, thank you very much, everyone.
Okay.
Anyway, what you're seeing in the bottom left is the city of Erbil, which is ancient Arbela, one of the main cities of ancient Assyria. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. The battle one of the battles where Alexander the Great defeated Darius was right nearby at Gaugamela. And so it's an example of a very ancient city that's being completely drowned by massive population growth. And that destroys heritage, sites get leveled, flattened. And then the last major one is economic development and agricultural intensification, because you have to feed people and people need to be able to live. And so that involves enormous devastation to cultural heritage, ancient sites and monuments as cities expand, as people build irrigation canals. Here, this is the site I worked at in Syria, and right next to it is an irrigation canal that they dug it right up to the edge of the mound. And often these mounds will simply be bulldozed flat just to accommodate irrigation. So those are the four horsemen of the heritage apocalypse. that are devastating heritage at an unprecedented rate. And we might add a last one that's emerging, and that's global climate change, which is also having a big effect on heritage. And we're only now beginning to see what that is. Now, in connection, in relation to those four devastating things to heritage, cultural heritage has become enormously politicized. And we saw that especially with the rise of ISIS in the Syrian and Iraqi, the Syrian civil war. And we all have seen how ISIS blew up the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Palmyra. We've seen how this is them smashing the statues, Assyrian and other statues in the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq. And they were even giving out licenses to people to loot sites as long as you paid 20% of what you made to as a tax to ISIS. So the politicization of heritage has also had a very, very bad effect on destroying heritage and accelerating these processes. The illicit antiquities trade is an enormous factor. It's very hard to track. It's very secretive, but it's highly profitable. It's growing larger. And I'm very sorry to say that, we know that the US is the leader in the world market for legal art, but it turns out that the US and the UK are the two largest markets in the world for illicit smuggled art. And of course, China is moving up fast in the rankings and as they are in everything else. But just to give you just a little taste of how lucrative, frighteningly lucrative it is this little, very small statue. It's about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 inches tall. It's called the Guinol Lioness, and it's from Mesopotamia in the Uruk period, the period when the first cities and states emerged. And it was sold at Sotheby's for $57 million for this tiny little 4-inch sculpture. So that gives you just a little taste of how much money is being made in the illicit market. And with conflict, whenever there's a breakdown of civil society, the illicit antiquities trade flourishes. So it's a very serious, enormous problem. And it's easy, because the news is so bad, it's easy to just give up and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. But I would argue that, in fact, there are a whole series of things that we can do where we honestly can make a difference as citizens. And I'm using that term citizens advisedly because that's part of what we have. It's not just freedoms, but we have responsibilities as well. And part of our responsibilities are to ask, what kind of a world are we leaving to our children, not just environmentally, but where our past is just gone. What are we leaving them? And as stewards of heritage in our own countries, we have a responsibility to protect one of the greatest resources of our countries. So I would argue there are things we can do. So one of the first things is we can enact and then especially enforce effective laws to protect cultural heritage. A lot of countries have the laws and don't enforce them. Second thing we can do is we can repatriate illicit antiquities when they are recovered, return them to their countries of origin. And that is completely doable if we're fortunate enough to catch the bad guys and recover the stolen art. Third thing we can do is we can restore damaged artifacts and monuments and sites. Fourth thing we can do is rescue people and sites and artifacts. So for instance, during the Syrian civil war, when ISIS conquered Iraq, there are organizations called Scholarly Rescue that have been able to rescue scholars, get them out of the countries where their lives are at risk. Then another thing we can do is to be proactive, and that is, I call it preservation through documentation, which is to document the sites and the monuments and the museum holdings, to take an inventory of museums, to know what's there. So God forbid, if anything happens to those museums, we can at least know what's missing and try and track it down. Also, as part of being proactive, we can train local experts that the best way to preserve heritage is in its place of origin and train the local people to take care of it and to develop local infrastructures, departments of antiquities, ministries of culture, national museums, we can develop those local infrastructures. Another very important thing we can do is educate the public, the military, and government officials. And those are three very different audiences. And we have to be able to talk to all of them to explain in terms that will be meaningful to them why they should care about this and why they should work to preserve it. And in the current atmosphere in the United States, one of the best ways to get people to preserve heritage is to explain the connection between global terrorism and the destruction of heritage. And the last thing is one thing that is not as well known, but the United States doesn't have a blanket law to preserve cultural heritage and to prohibit the importation of illicit antiquities. Instead, it operates on what's called a bilateral model, where there's a cultural policy advisory committee that where the head of it is appointed by the president, and you can apply to the State Department and this Cultural Policy Advisory Committee to get a bilateral treaty between your country and the United States that will ban the importation of antiquities from that country. And the CPAC committee is sort of evenly divided between museum people and academics, and there are also numismatists in there. And you have to make a very strong argument to show that your country has laws prohibiting antiquities. You have enforcement mechanisms in place to try and prevent the smuggling of antiquities. But despite it, antiquities are being smuggled out. And you also have to prove that those antiquities are reaching the US. And if you can prove all of those things, then it's a reasonably good shot that the United States, through the State Department and the president, will make a bilateral treaty to ban the importation of those illicit antiquities into the US. So these are all areas where we can make a difference by being involved in them. And Afghanistan is one of these classic examples of a country whose heritage is being devastated. In the case of Afghanistan, the main culprit has been 41 years of literally nonstop war that has destroyed the country. And, you know, people like you, Barbara, where you were fortunate enough to visit the country before the Soviet invasion, it was a very, very different place. And what's emerged after all this conflict is very discouraging. And this war has taken place in sort of 4 stages. The first is the Soviet invasion, 10-year occupation, and eventually withdrawal in 1989. And on the upper left, you see the Russian troops, and they're leaving Afghanistan, crossing I've always loved it at Termez in the Oxus or Amu Darya River in northern Afghanistan. It's the international friendship bridge between the
Barbara, we saw that.
Oh, well, that's how the Russians invaded, was by crossing the international friendship bridge, and that's how they left. But then after they left, as the moment they left, a civil war broke out between the various Mujahideen resistance groups fighting for power. And it was a very brutal civil war with basically Afghanistan dissolving into warlords fighting each other. And eventually, one group, the Taliban, won out over all the others and took over 90% of the country, except for a little chunk in the north. So the Taliban ruled the country from the time of their takeover in 1995 until 2001, when in the spring, they destroyed the Bamyan Buddhas. In the fall, 9/11 took place and the US invaded. And then finally, from 2001 till the present, there's been the US and NATO-led counterinsurgency effort that up to the present It has not been working very well, as you know, that's a whole other story, or that's a 3 beer story. But anyway, Afghanistan has been devastated as a result of it. There's been massive looting, massive destruction of sites and monuments and artifacts. Now, Afghanistan's a good example of some of the items on that list of things that you can do about devastation of heritage. One of them is you can try to document the heritage objects and put the word out so that art dealers and art collectors and museums will be on the lookout for smuggled artifacts and will do the right thing to return them. And it's done through the ICOM, the International Council of Museums, which issues things called red lists for different countries where their antiquities are at risk. So here you see some pages from the red list for Afghanistan, and it's been, this document is put out. You can get it on the ICOM website, and it's in Dari and Pashto, the 2 national languages of Afghanistan, and also in English. So you can know what kind of antiquities. If you see stuff like this, all your antennae should be out to make sure that this is legal antiquities, that we're legally exported, because in many, many cases, they're not. But every so often, there are little victories, and in this case, it's quite a major victory. And that is that at Heathrow Airport, where a lot of the antiquities are transiting through, over a couple of years, the UK customs people interdicted literally 4 tons of antiquities smuggled out of Afghanistan. They did, including the very, very famous a number of examples of ivories, carved ivories from Bagram, which is one of the art treasures of the world. And a number of these were smuggled out of Afghanistan and made their way, were passing through Heathrow where they were caught. The British Museum conserved them, exhibited them briefly, and then put all of the stuff that they had confiscated onto a military transport and flew it back to Bagram Air Force Base. And then from there, it was taken secretly at night to Kabul in the museum. So actually, if you believe in the Wheel of Dharma, there's something really poetic about the Bagram ivories being returned to Afghanistan by way of Bagram Air Force Base. There's coincidence? I don't think so. So you can interdict and repatriate objects that are stolen. You can also restore monuments sometimes. And this is an example of we were talking at the background behind me is from Herat in northwestern Afghanistan. This is the very ancient citadel, the Kalat Ikhtiaruddin in Herat. And it's an ancient mound that goes all the way back to the Bronze Age, with a magnificent citadel built on top of it. So the US State Department funded the restoration of the Herat citadel, and there's a before and after. But of course, sadly,
When
we
was
know
that
that
done? Excuse me, what year was that restored?
that was done in, I think between 2005 and 2010. So they did a really beautiful job on it, and they really brought in historical consultants, and it's
Thank
one
you.
of the rare success stories. But not everything can be restored, and the Bamyan Buddhas are the saddest, the most salient example, because people think of them as carved in stone, and that's only partially true. The rest of it is, you see all these holes in the picture on the right. Can you see all these holes in the back of the niche? Those were armatures where wooden beams were stuck into them, and build outs around the stone were made in plaster, which was then, they carved the plaster and painted it and even gilded it in many cases. So when the Taliban blew up the Buddhas, they literally just turned into sand, and it's impossible. It's physically impossible to just glue the pieces back together. You can't do it. And so there are all kinds of debates about what to do with restoring these monuments. And sort of just as in Iraq, in Afghanistan, much less known in the West, the National Museum is sort of the focal point for preserving cultural heritage. And the museum was devastated in the Afghan civil war. It was on the border between the territories of two different warring factions of Mujahideen and their warlords in Kabul. And so the whole museum was looted, it was rocketed, and it was burned. And the upper left picture, you see what it looked like. The two pictures on the left, the outside, totally burned out, windows all gone. And this is the galleries, just shells. And now after the US-led invasion, the museum's been beautifully restored. And these are pictures of the exact same places. And you can see how beautifully the building of the museum has been restored. But you can make the building look nice again, but the fact is 70% of the museum collections were looted or destroyed. 90% of the museum records were destroyed in the looting and rocketing and burning. And we don't really know. We think that the museum housed about 200,000 objects before, but it was never inventoried. So we estimate that something like 140,000 objects were lost. Now, just to put that into perspective for you, everyone has heard about the looting of the Baghdad Museum. The total amount of artifacts that were lost from the Baghdad Museum is 15,000. So less than a tenth, or about a tenth, of the number of objects that were looted from the Baghdad Museum, and no one from the Kabul Museum, and no one even knows about it. It's a horrible tragedy. So what I want to show you is why everybody should care about the Kabul Museum, the National Museum of Afghanistan, and its objects. I want to show you 5 very, very unique and significant collections of the National Museum of Afghanistan. So the first is from the excavations at Bagram, which was ancient Kapisa. Kapisa was the summer capital of the Kushan Empire. The Kushan Empire was one of the main empires that controlled the Silk Road, which went from China in the Han Dynasty to the Kushan Empire, to first the Parthian and then Sasanian Empire in Iran, Greater Iran, and then the Roman Empire to reach the Mediterranean. So from its very founding, the Kushan Empire and much of Afghanistan was at the heart of the Silk Road. And it was scientifically excavated in the 30s, right before World War II. And they found magnificent things. They found 2 storerooms with like all of the goodies from merchants on the Silk Road. And it showed you every culture on the Silk Road. They found Han Dynasty lacquer work. They found these Bagram ivories, which are beautiful Indian, South Asian Indian style, enormous and beautifully carved ivories. There are Roman bronze weights. And then on the right, this is one of my favorites. It's the largest known depiction of the lighthouse in Alexandria in Egypt. And it's carved out of a single piece of like rock crystal. And there's the pharos and the statue on top of it. And you can imagine some guy lugging this all the way back from Alexandria to Kapisa and saying, look, honey, look what I brought back for you. And it's a totally unique piece. And so the Bagram collection is magnificent because nothing else that we have shows us so perfectly the cosmopolitan, cultural, and economic operations and functioning of the Silk Road in the first period when it came into being in the time of the Han Dynasty and the Kushans. Second collection is also remarkable. It's the easternmost colonies that were founded by Alexander the Great and his Hellenistic successors like Antiochus and a whole range of rulers who eventually declared independence from the Seleucid Empire and set up their own colonies. And Ai Khanum, which means Lady Moon, Ai is the word for moon, And it's, again, this cultural synthesis of the Middle Eastern world and the Greek classical world and the Bactrian world. And it's totally unique. And it was excavated by the French right before the Soviet invasion. Third collection that's really remarkable is of early Buddhist and Gandharan art, where some of the Gandharan period is the first period when people actually depicted the Buddha instead of these aniconic depictions of the Buddha where they would just show his parasol or the banyan tree under which he meditated to achieve enlightenment. So the Gandharan region spans southern Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan. And it produced magnificent, very unique art, this synthesis of Hellenistic styles and South Asian styles. And the two most important collections are at the Musée Guimet in Paris and at the National Museum of Afghanistan. A fourth one is the Bactrian treasure of nomadic gold from northern Afghanistan. And it's relatively close to Mazar-e Sharif in the north. And this is the period when nomadic groups invaded Bactria, destroyed the Greco-Bactrian Hellenistic states, and laid the groundwork for what eventually evolved into the Kushan Empire. It's this incredible trove of gold that was excavated by a Russian archaeologist named Viktor Saryanidi, literally weeks before the Soviet invasion in 1979. Then the last example is not well known, but it's really cool, is this carved Nuristani wood Nuristani wood carvings. And Nuristan, this area is a mountainous, heavily forested area in southeastern Afghanistan. It's the area where plays a major role in Rudyard Kipling's novel, The Man Who Would Be King, and this great buddy movie with Sean Connery and Michael Caine. But what's so cool about Nuristan is it was a pagan area until 1895. This was the last part of this region where people clung to the ancient Indo-Iranian polytheistic religions. And they were forcibly conquered by the Amir Abdul Rahman of Afghanistan in 1895. And he gave people the choice of either converting to Islam or being executed. And so people converted to Islam, and that what used to be called Kafiristan, which means the land of the unbelievers, became known as Nuristan, the land of light or enlightenment. So it's a very rare collection because as pagan art, most of it was burned or otherwise destroyed over the years. So it's a magnificent, the holdings of the Kabul Museum really are remarkable treasures of Afghan heritage and world heritage, and highly significant for pretty much everything. So in 2012, we started working with the National Museum of Afghanistan, and we're doing 4 different projects in Afghanistan with the Afghan Institute of Archaeology on the one hand and the National Museum. So our partnership with the museum is doing an inventory of the National Museum and training conservators and curators and database managers. We also have a project that is using satellite remote sensing to map all the archaeological sites in Afghanistan to document them and ideally set the stage for their preservation. A third thing we're doing is the Mobile Museum Project, which is an outreach and education project to teach high school students in Afghanistan about their own heritage. And the last thing that we're doing is called the Hada Sculptural Restoration Project and Loss Assessment, where we're trying to restore a whole series of hundreds of statues of this early Buddhist art that were smashed by the Taliban right before they destroyed the Bamyan Buddhas. So our projects in Afghanistan, I think, have been pretty successful, and we've been able to get a lot done. And I just wanted to quickly mention that that's not something to take for granted, because a lot of development projects or aid projects just fall flat on their faces. They just fail. And there'd been 6 attempts before us to do an inventory of the museum, and every one of them failed. And the reason ours has been successful is a couple of principles. The first is that we work on site and in country to train people instead of bringing them out to Vienna or Paris or wherever for short stints of training. So our guys have been working in Kabul, punching the clock, going to the museum every day, and that built up a lot of credibility with our Afghan colleagues. Second thing is we developed our database of the inventory database of the museum in full consultation with the Afghans, where we asked them, how do you guys record the artifacts? How, before all the records were burned, how did you do it? And so what we did is we designed our database so it would reflect the things that they wanted to be in it. And of course we'd add other things, but the core of it is what they want. Another thing is the use of appropriate technology that the State Department wanted us to do, like the absolute state of the art, Oracle or SAP databases of for our inventory of the museum. And we said, I told them, no, we're not going to do it that way because it won't work. You can't even guarantee electricity there, let alone internet connections. And it wouldn't be sustainable because, as you know, things like Oracle and SAP, you have to pay an annual subscription fee, and there's no way the Afghans could even afford that. So we did it on a laptop database like using FileMaker Pro, which is an off-the-shelf software package that anyone can buy. So it's sustainable, and you can run it without electricity, you can run on the battery of your laptop, and you can run it without the internet. And I think that those are some of the main reasons why our inventory has worked. We did it bilingually. So if you can see on the screen there, it's the data is recorded in both Dari, one of the languages of Afghanistan, and in English. And every object, you can see one of our guys. This is my former student and colleague, Michael Fisher, and one of the curators at the National Museum, and they're entering the data in both Dari and in English in tandem. We also conserved the artifacts as we were inventorying them. And we made the database look like what they were used to and what they felt was useful. And it's now essentially complete. We have 99.8 or 9% of all the pieces that belong to the National Museum are now in a computer database with digital images, so that even if, I keep saying God forbid a lot, but God forbid, even if those objects are destroyed, a digital record of photos, descriptions, and measurements will exist. So the information will survive, even if the actual objects get destroyed. The second project that we've been doing is the Afghan Heritage Mapping Project, where we're using satellite mapping to map all the archaeological sites in Afghanistan using remote sensing imagery. And it's really important because the only source of income for Afghanistan realistically is mineral extraction. You've heard of Mes Aynak, the giant copper mine in Southeast Afghanistan that's due to be destroyed by open pit mining. So basically what we want to do is we want to map all the archaeological sites so we can protect them. And when economic development is scheduled to take place, we can let the Afghan government know this development will risk destroying all of these sites. And so we have a team in at the University of Chicago at the Oriental Institute that's working its way through satellite images. And we've been working for several years now, and our goal is to cover all of Afghanistan, to put all the information on a geospatial ArcGIS database. And we're training archaeologists at the Afghan Institute of Archaeology in how to use the database. And at the end of our project, we're going to turn over all of the data to them so they can continue working on it. They can manage their own heritage. And when economic development takes place, they can tell the government this is what's endangered. So just to show you an example of that, if you look, I don't know if you can see the cursor that I'm moving back and forth, there's this long line there are different boxes that show search areas where we're looking through satellite imagery, but this long curvy line is the line of TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India natural gas pipeline will bring natural gas from Turkmenistan all the way to the Indian Ocean, basically. And so what the Afghan Institute of Archaeology is doing with our help is we're searching a 5-kilometer buffer on either side of where the pipeline is going to be to record every archaeological heritage site, so we can tell the government of Afghanistan these sites need to be mapped and excavated as rescue archaeology to preserve them. And it's actually, we've gotten a lot done. That the total area of Afghanistan is 652,861 square kilometers. We've mapped 1/3 of it going through satellite imagery, and we found more than almost 24,000 heritage sites through our work there. And the whole idea is preserve heritage, but enable thoughtful economic development at the same time. It also enables us to track the looting of sites by looking at time series data of old satellite pictures and new satellite pictures. One on the left is from the 70s, and it's this giant Sasanian fortress, and you can still see buildings there, and it's intact. But by 2001, the entire inside of that square fort looks like Swiss cheese because it's been entirely looted. So by having the time series data, we can track looting when it starts and when it finishes. And we've also developed new techniques using things like, if you want to know, is the site still being looted? Well, the only way to do it is, if you can't physically be there, is look at the satellite images and see, are there more looters pits there? Which means some poor suffering graduate student has to count on an image every one of the holes. And so one of our poor suffering graduate students at University of Chicago developed a computer algorithm that uses principal components analysis to identify what does the visual signature of a looter's pit look like. And you program the computer, look for areas on the image that fit this. And so the computer has learned how to count the looters pits. And that way we can tell, is it stable, is the looting stopped, or is it continuing? So we're inventing new technologies to try and monitor and stop looting. And we've also been training the Afghans. We've trained like 25 different heritage specialists in Afghanistan through a series of courses. We send teachers to Kabul to teach them, and we brought members of the Afghan Institute of Archaeology, the core of that cadre of people. And they've gotten pretty good at GIS, and we built GIS labs at the Afghan Institute of Archaeology. So the whole idea is sustainability, building capacity so the Afghans can take care of their own heritage. Another initiative that we've been doing is called the Mobile Museum, where because the security situation in Afghanistan is so bad, high school students in the outlying provincial cities, they can't come to Kabul to visit the National Museum. And even if security allowed, the roads are awful. They're just devastated. So the idea was, let's bring the museum to students in high schools across Afghanistan and, of course, in Kabul itself. So we're teaching them about their own history and heritage, and about the importance of the National Museum as a place that belongs to them as citizens, so they can learn about their own heritage. And a big part of this is this idea of building a national identity through a shared cultural heritage. Because as you know, Afghanistan is composed of many very diverse and not always friendly different ethno-linguistic groups. But a shared national identity is part of the nation building and post-conflict peacemaking state building process. So we've been carrying out our programs of education for high school kids all across Afghanistan in 5 different provincial cities. In fact, our team is in Herat right now, right here in the purple area in northwestern Afghanistan. But we've also been in Mazar-e Sharif, in Kabul, in Bamiyan, in Kandahar, which is kind of a risky area in the south, and in Nangarhar, or the city of Jalalabad, right next to the Khyber Pass, where the ancient monastery site, Buddhist monastery site of Hada is. So we've been able we've targeted both boys' high schools and girls' high schools and orphanages and Lincoln Learning Centers, which are situated, they're sponsored by the State Department, and they're located inside the local cultural offices. So it's a place where high school and college students can come for various reasons. So we're doing our program in all of these venues, and gender equity is a very big part of what we're trying to do, and we want to reach the different ethno-linguistic groups across the country. So it's a multimedia project. So we start with videos where the director of the museum introduces these high school students in these different provincial cities. This is what the museum is like. He explains, this is our history. This belongs to all of you. And you can come here and see your own history. We trained special course instructors. This is Zakia and this is Sajjad. We trained them in the archaeology of Afghanistan and in different teaching methods. And they've been going out doing these programs, and they're doing them as we speak in Herat. And in the last year, we were able to teach the program in 144 different schools and orphanages. And we reached more than 12,000 students with this mobile museum project to teach them about their heritage. And a big part of it is we made 3D replicas of objects, key artifacts in the museum that represented the different time periods. And after we did the 3D scans of them, we 3D printed them at the University of Chicago. Then we brought them over to Afghanistan. Then we painted them so that they would look like the ancient artifacts. And so after students get presentations about their history, they're able to pick up, touch, examine the replicas of the actual artifacts to really make history come alive for them. And we leave in each of the schools, we leave a series of posters of the highlights of each of the main civilizational periods of Afghanistan. So even after we leave, Herat or wherever, that there's something that remains in the schools, in the hallways. Here you can see in the bottom right, at a girls' high school, the posters of the different periods, so students can learn about and see pictures of their own heritage. And we made a video documentary about it, about this mobile museum project. And part of it, we interviewed students, and it was wonderful to hear in their own words what they felt they were getting out of the project. And it was this total eye-opener. Most of them said, we had no idea of any of this stuff. And we're really glad to know it's out there. So it's really kind of a heartwarming thing, actually. So next steps at the museum are loss assessment and restoring objects by the Taliban. Loss assessment means once we've done our inventory and we know what's in the museum, we can start to figure out what's missing, okay? So this is one of the earliest inscriptions done in the Bactrian language. The Bactrians took the Greek alphabet and started writing down their own language in using a Greek script. They had to invent 3 or 4 letters, but that's fine. So all those blocks were in the museum. We inventoried all of them. And once we inventoried them, we photo mosaic them back together, and oops, we saw that 3 of the stones were missing. So they've either, when I say missing, that means either they were destroyed by the Taliban or they were looted and smuggled out. So we can start to make a list of what's missing from the museum. And then we can notify Interpol and ICOM and UNESCO and auction houses around the world what's missing. So how do we do it? There's a small number of catalogs of parts of the museum from before the Civil War. So what we do is we compare the pre-war catalogs and other documentation with our own inventory. So if an object is present in the pre-war catalog, but we don't find it in our database, then we know it was either stolen or destroyed. And we have a small number of sources. This one by Francine Tissot of the masterpieces, the real unique objects in the museum. There's Nancy Dupre's Guide to the National Museum from 1974. And then this wonderful photographer named Josephine Powell visited the museum in the 50s and took photos of everything she could see there. And all this stuff is in the Sackler Museum at Harvard, all her photo archives. So we have pictures of what was there in the museum before the war. And we've been comparing whatever we can find from before the war with what our inventory found, and using that as a way to estimate how much was stolen or destroyed from the museum. So this is just an example. There are these magnificent coin hoards from the museum, and the pre-war holdings of, like, from Ai Khanum, that Hellenistic colony on the Oxus River, 63 coins before the war. Now there are only 4 left. 127 Chamani Khazuri, 46 left. That's from when it was time of the Persian Empire. That's Gill's Persian principle. Kunduz, Mirzakeh, the largest coin hoard ever found in the ancient world. There were 17,000 coins in the museum before the war. We could only find 2,195. So in the end, we figured there were 37,000 coins recorded in the museum before, and only about 12,000 survived. So something like 68% of the pre-war coin holdings have been looted. So this is the first time anyone has ever been able to quantify what's missing. Then the other idea we had was to make digital wanted posters of the real masterpieces. And this one is remarkable. Most of you probably know about the edicts of Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor of India in the 3rd century BC. And he erected edicts or carved pillars or stone carved inscriptions all around his empire, where he articulated the basic principles of Buddhism. And it turns out that there are about 3 or 4 Ashoka edicts in Afghanistan. And a piece of one of them was in the National Museum. I want you to look at that picture, because that doesn't look like any Indian script that you might know. That's because it's written in Aramaic, in Imperial Aramaic. And you might ask, what the hell is that doing in Afghanistan? And it turns out that in the Persian Empire, the Achaemenids used Imperial Aramaic as their administrative language. So here you have this amazing thing. About 70 or 80 years after Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire, the emperor of India was carving edicts in Aramaic in the area of Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, because the people there still knew Aramaic and they still knew Greek as part of that had become part of their culture. So it's a remarkable artifact. It's missing from the museum. It's very unique, very easily identifiable, and we want to make sure everyone will know about it. So our goal is to make these digital wanted posters for every one of the unique artifacts that we can, and make them available to auction houses and law enforcement everywhere, so no one can say, no collector can say, no auction house, no museum can say, we didn't know this was stolen from Afghanistan, because they will know. And you'll note that we list who took the pictures of it, and it was published in 1949, and that establishes provenance, because usually when you confiscate an object, you say, well, that's very nice, and I'm sure it's ancient, but how can you prove it was stolen from Afghanistan? Our having these published articles and photos in archives makes it unassailable, the provenance, so this will have to be returned to Afghanistan. That's our hope, and that's our goal. Finally, the last project I want to talk about is the Hada Sculptural Restoration Project. This is an example of that early Gandharan art, and you can see just looking at it, it's not Indian, it's not Hellenistic, it's a fusion of the two. It's very rare art. And this is what happened when, in the run-up to 9/11, to the destruction of the Bamyan Buddhas in 9/11, the Taliban worked their way through the National Museum with sledgehammers, and every statue they found, they sledgehammered into pieces. And that you're looking at 6 of the 12 trunks with those pieces. What happened is There was nothing the curators of the museum could do. They had to stand there, they'd get their heads blown off by the Taliban. They had to stand there, watch the statues be smashed to bits. They waited until they left, and then at very great risk to themselves, they swept up the pieces, hid them in these trunks. If they'd been caught, they'd have been executed. There's no doubt about it. And then after the US-led invasion, the secret came out that these things existed. So we've been working to reassemble them. And this is where those old pictures become really valuable, because what we're trying to do is there's 7,600 fragments. We're guesstimating that there are at least 350 statues were smashed up. It's like trying to do 350 crossword puzzles where all the pieces have been mixed up and the picture on the boxes are all gone. So we've been working really hard for the last 4 years. And this is an example of, we were able to partially reassemble this one sculpture. And we found in one of the Josephine Powell photos from 1957, we found her picture of that thing. So we know, and we can track it down, and we can describe it and record its provenance. And ideally, that'll help us restore it even further now that we know what the original looked like. And so these are examples of how, as we reassemble the statues, or the partially reassembled ones, we can track them down to originals that were photographed in the Francine Tissot catalog as well. So we're working our way back towards restoring as much as possible of this priceless collection. We're also using 3D imaging to document the collections, and we're experimenting with the idea of, if we can scan all the fragments, we might be able to digitally reassemble them. Even if we can't physically be in Kabul because of the coronavirus, we can maybe reassemble them digitally. So those are examples of cultural heritage projects in a very difficult area where we're documenting the antiquities, the heritage items. We're training curators and conservators and IT people in how to take care of their heritage. We're doing public museum education and outreach, and we're working to try and forestall the smuggling of antiquities on the art market. And what I wanted to do, take the lessons of what seems to work in Afghanistan and raise it to the next level and try and apply it towards the global heritage crisis and not just Afghanistan. And to do that, the University of Chicago asked me to give them a proposal to set up a university-wide center to deal with cultural heritage, which I did, and they've very recently, they approved the creation of the Chicago Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation. And our mission is to be interdisciplinary with a global focus and to work in partnership with the local people in countries all around the world whose heritage is at risk. And that we're going to focus on both tangible heritage, objects you can touch or sites or monuments, but also intangible heritage like threatened languages or traditional arts and crafts like textiles and things like that. And so there are a couple of things that I think are a unique mix. There are other cultural heritage centers around, but I think the particular model, we're trying to come up with an innovative model for how to preserve heritage. And the first is, by being based in a university, we have a real advantage because we can draw on this enormous range and depth of expertise. When you look at, there's something like 11 different departments across the university that do things that very directly relate to heritage preservation, including the library, which is magnificent at digital heritage preservation. We're focusing on tangible and intangible heritage. We're explicitly working as partnerships where we ask the people in the countries at risk what's important to them, and we're working with them instead of coming in from the outside and telling them what to do. We're emphasizing long-term sustainability by training people because we know grants come and go. And as I showed you with our heritage mapping project, we try to integrate economic development into our heritage preservation planning so that the local people will see a benefit an economic benefit to preserving heritage. It can help tourism. It can help develop infrastructure and things like that. And overall, I want to take us from the reactive stance where we're fixing stuff that's already been destroyed. And I want us to be proactive by going to countries that are not at war, countries like the Central Asian countries, and help them to build the infrastructure and train people to preserve their own heritage before anything bad happens. So I want us to be very focused on proactive strategies and not just reactive ones. And we have a real advantage with the University of Chicago that we can have this kind of instant global reach, because I've worked out an arrangement with the University of Chicago's Office of Global Engagement, where the Chicago centers in London, in Paris, in New Delhi, in Beijing, and Hong Kong. And that you know how difficult it would be to bring people from many of these countries at risk to the United States for training and programs. But with the help of these University of Chicago centers, we can bring the programs to them. They can come to these centers, which are branded to the University of Chicago and have nice resources. And so we can carry out programs there, conferences there, workshops there, in addition to actual hands-on projects. So I'm sorry if that went on too long. That's the range of things we're doing. And I think this has enormous potential. And I'm just, it's so devastating, the coronavirus and the bans on travel, that everything had to pretty much come to a halt. But as soon as they'll let us travel again, these are the things that we're going to implement. And we have a bunch of projects that we want to start up with. A digital heritage lab, an internet-based world register of illicit heritage objects, like those digital wanted posters that we're developing. We want to help countries get their main sites inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List so they can protect their own. We're working to establish a council of Central and South Asian museums so they can share best practices in how to preserve their own heritage and build connections between these 5 republics that don't necessarily get along with each other. And then we also want to work with people from the Chicago Linguistics Department and other places to preserve indigenous languages. So basically, we're trying to implement this new model, and I'm hoping that the next 2 to 5 years, this thing will really be making a major difference in preserving heritage around the world. And in doing that, I'm sticking with the motto that's carved in stone outside the National Museum of Afghanistan, where it says, "A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive." So my apologies for the length of that. I was trying to squeeze way too much in, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Gil, you're astonishing, and thank you for doing this. The keepers of the keys, are any of them still alive?
Oh, yes. Barbara's referring to this very interesting custom or practice. It's not just in Afghanistan, but in the Middle East as well, that everyone is worried about an inside job where someone's going to rob the museum. So a small number of people are called the key holders, and each one has a key to a different storeroom. And they're basically scattered all over the country. So it makes it very hard for someone to come in and open up the museum. And they can open up the storerooms. So you need a group of them, the key holder and 2 or 3 other people, before you can open the storeroom. And you know who's responsible if that thing is open when you show up there. So they're trying to transition from a key holder system to a curator system. But yes, there are still key holders around. And some of them are quite aged, and many of them are people who actually witnessed the Taliban smashing all that stuff from Hada.
And we were never able to get the oral history. It was never.
I think it's going to happen, Barbara. I've spoken informally with people, And I believe if we don't push them too much to name names of the warlords, because the warlords are still alive. And many of them are the people who facilitated that, did the looting. But we know there was something like 12 curators who were in on this, who witnessed the destruction of the sculptures, and they can tell the story. And I've spoken to two of them, so I still think that in a year or so I will be able to videotape them.
Fantastic.
Well, fingers crossed. We'll do this. To be continued. Yes, Betty.
Hi, Gil. This was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. But I have a couple of questions, and
Sure.
I'm going to put all of them out there really quickly so that you can take them at your leisure. One is, how has your relationship with U.S. government funding changed or stayed the same since 2016? And we know what 2016 means. And of course, you mentioned the effects of the pandemic, so I'll leave that question out. But when you're hooking up with these other museums, it was your point 4 in that last list that you had up there.
Yeah.
Are you hooking up with other Western museums that have collections from these areas to do the same sorts of data preservation and object preservation, cultural preservation that you're doing?
Okay. So
There are really
there-
2 questions. One is your relationship with the government of the United States and grants that would have come through the US government. How has it changed under the whose administration? And
he who must not be named. as
yeah,
they say in Harry
the
Potter.
Orange Menace. And what other museums, Western museums, have you hooked up with to collaborate with in these projects?
Okay. The first one is a question about relationship with the State Department. The State Department has been extraordinarily generous with us. We've gotten about $8.5 million in State Department funding through the U.S. Embassy in Kabul for cultural heritage preservation. And that's a very unique situation. The government looked so bad after the looting of the Baghdad Museum that they decided they were really going to make a serious effort in Afghanistan to preserve heritage as kind of a soft power diplomacy. And Afghanistan has always been a very, very special case. And after 2016, we were very worried that that was just going to vanish. But because it's such a volatile, sensitive situation, up till now, the funding has been, we never find out until the last minute. And usually it'll be like at the end of the fiscal year, it's like, oh, I found all this money between the cushions of my sofa. They'll say, well, we have some unspent funds and we'll make it available to you. So because we've established a good track record with them, they know we'll do our work, we'll come in under budget. They have been giving us additional funding. And I have to say, so far it's been very good, but everyone can see the writing on the wall. The US troop presence is down now to, I believe, 4,500. And in the next couple of weeks, it'll be down to 2,500. And once the troops aren't there, I think the US's focus, there's a very big risk. I mean, that the US's focus, people will just shift their attention away from Afghanistan and that funding will evaporate. The other risk there's kind of a perfect storm, Betty, is that you have the shifting of American attention and then a rapidly deteriorating security situation, and then the coronavirus. So we know our grants are going to end in about a year. And we know the clock is ticking for us because it's highly unlikely they'll renew our funding. At the same time, we can't go there, even though we know we need to get in and do our work before the security situation falls apart completely. but we can't because of the coronavirus. So it really is the perfect storm. And I should add to you that it's really tragic that our assistant field director in Kabul, a guy named Taj Mali, died of the coronavirus. And we were counting on him because we couldn't be there. And he was helping us keep our operations going with our Afghan colleagues, even without the foreigners being there. So it's very worrisome. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to recognize what's happening. And there's a Hebrew expression that says, "Who is wise? He who sees what is about to be born." Ezahu chacham haroeh et hanolad, what is about to be born. So the writing's on the wall, and I see that the wise thing to do is to shift our focus to projects in Central Asia and in the Middle East. So realistically, I'm expecting, it's not that I want this, but I'm expecting that our projects are going to end in about a year. Okay. Your second question was
Other
about,
Western museums.
yeah, which I think is a brilliant idea in a lot of ways. Like because the legacy, the history of archaeology and colonialism and all of that, there are lots of very important heritage sites around the world where half of the collection is in Western museums and the other third, say, is in the host country. So the gold from the Royal Cemetery of Ur, 1/3 of it's in the British Museum, 1/3 of it is in the University Museum at Penn, and 1/3 of it is in Baghdad. So, one of the things I think is possible, because I really want this Heritage Center to focus a lot on digital heritage, is to reunite collections digitally so that scholars around the world and people in these countries, the host countries or the countries at risk, that they can, if nothing else, they can see the full range of objects. And I think that an approach like that is something that would really resonate with people, and it would be acceptable to them. So museums that would never dream of repatriating their objects. I mean, honestly, I don't see the British Museum giving the gold ram in the thicket from Ur back to Iraq. But they'd be open to something like that. But what you're saying, I'm really glad you mentioned it, because it made me think that one could sort of work with those museums that have materials from a specific place and say, look, we're not asking you to return the stuff, but you do have a responsibility. And we could sort of try to use guilt tripping constructively to get them to fund projects of collaboration with the local museums in these countries. I know in Central Asia, I went to this, in Tajikistan, I went to this place called Penjikent, which was one of the main cities of the Silk Road. It's in Tajikistan, but it's just across the border, 13 or 25 kilometers from Samarkand. But it's one of the, like Bagram, it's one of the only Silk Road cities from the heyday of the Silk Road that was excavated. And there are these astounding wall paintings there from right before the Islamic conquest. Well, most of that stuff got cut off the walls and brought to the Hermitage. And the Tajiks know there's no way in hell they'll ever get that stuff back from the Hermitage. But why not try to build this kind of program of reuniting collections digitally, and this idea of a sort of sister cities almost arrangement, or sister museums arrangement. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, and it's a great idea, and I'm writing it down, and I want to build that element in to what I'd already been thinking about, just the digital reuniting of collections. This idea of partnerships with museums is a really good one. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Who else has good ideas? T.S. Eliot said, bad poets borrow, good poets steal.
Shama?
I don't have an idea. I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned Messainak because
Yes.
there's Chinese mines that paid money to have it because of the copper mines there.
Yes.
And so you had talking about vision, the places you're going to, all those areas are going to be running the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes.
Isn't that going to be a problem? And would it, I'm sure you do it anyway, because most of those areas have been mapped topography wise by the oil and gas companies. Wouldn't they have a lot of the data you want anyway? Like, wouldn't that be a huge issue going to all those areas just showing up now?
Well, first of all, it's very dangerous to go to those places. Mes Aynak is in Logar province, which, you know, the government rules by day and the Taliban rule after 5 o'clock, you know. So getting there is physically risky. That's one thing. Second, the Belt and Road Initiative is very interested in having a cultural arm to it. And I just gave a virtual paper at a conference in Xi'an on the World Culture and Tourism Forum. So they're really interested in this stuff as part of the Belt and Road, and they're open to it. And the Chinese are doing a lot of cultural diplomacy, loaning exhibits to other countries like Uzbekistan, for instance. And they've hosted this Bactrian gold exhibit at 14 cities in China. I don't know how many millions of people have seen these Bactrian treasures from Afghanistan. So it's all very interconnected. That's at the governmental level. At the level of companies doing exploration for mineral resources, that is an issue. On the other hand, one of the coolest things is, I don't know if you remember, but for the Afghan Heritage Mapping Project, I showed a map of Afghanistan with these big gray rectangles showing areas that were identified as very especially mineral rich areas. Well, that information, it came from the US Geological Survey, which did very detailed overflights back and forth over Afghanistan, and they were able to identify the multispectral signature of what iron deposits look like, what copper deposits look like. So they mapped the entire country, and that stuff is all available for free online. And so the Afghans have targeted these 20 areas of interest to for mining when they're able to, or if they're able to. So yes, it's true that the private companies would be very secretive about it, but you know, it helps when you're, you know, militarily, I won't say occupying Afghanistan, but you're militarily helping Afghanistan, that you can do these kind of overflights. So it's weird. It's a very strange mix of accessibility and inaccessibility. And that's why remote sensing is so valuable, because it's so difficult and dangerous to get there on the ground. I hope that answers what you're asking.
Gil,
Yes.
the Bactrian gold exhibit,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of been on permanent tour. Am I correct that for its own safety, they're keeping it out of Afghanistan? Did I read that somewhere, or am I making it up?
Oh, you are not making that up. Most Afghans, most of them are terrified of having this stuff come back, as they figure it'll get stolen or vandalized or destroyed or something. But after it's been on the road for so long and been packed up and unpacked and moved around to a point that the Afghans, at least for the time being, now that it's finishing this tour of 14 cities in China, they would like to have it stay home in Afghanistan, at least for a while, for conservation, because the stuff, it's very, very fragile, as you know. So that's what they say they want. Has it happened yet? I don't know for a fact that it has, but they say they want to do that. Anyone else?
Oh, where
Yeah.
did the gold come from from which they made the statues? Where did they get the gold to make?
Oh, Afghanistan is incredibly rich in natural resources. It's like the main source in the world for stuff like lapis lazuli, for instance. Gold mines in the north. It's a very, very mountainous, uplifted area. It's part of that whole Pamir knot, where the Eurasian tectonic plate and the South Asian Indian tectonic plate sort of smash into each other. So it pushes up very deep deposits, and there's incredible resources like Mes Aynak. That's the second largest known copper deposit on the planet. And gold and silver are like that as well. So it was local. Yeah, Penelope?
Yeah, I have a
Oh,
question.
sorry.
So can I know, there's always been conversation about these treasures going back to their countries of origin. And right now there are certain rules in place. I mean, I know in the area that we're interested in, there's this date of 1972.
Mhm.
But in hearing conversation coming out of India, they're now saying that that date really is a meaningless date. And even if people have paperwork supporting that it was a valid sale, that really doesn't mean anything, because the balance of power was so unequal, and the distribution of wealth, you know, the wealthy Americans and Europeans that were going to India to purchase these things had the means to acquire things that really should not have been acquired. Are you hearing a lot of sort of growth of these kinds of conversations where these parameters that have been drawn before are now being re-examined?
You know, you're raising like an incredibly difficult question, which is how do you handle things in the past when our ethical beliefs have evolved a lot over time, especially just since from the 19th through the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And there's no good answer to it. Like, for instance, the Elgin marbles. Well, they were legally exported from the Ottoman Empire at the time. Of course, the Greeks would say, well, wait a minute, the Ottomans conquered us. They had no right to do that. But by the laws of that time, what was done was completely legal. So we have this weird situation, like how do you handle that kind of thing? And so what UNESCO tried to do, and I really, personally, I think they did the only reasonable thing to do. You can't overturn laws. You have to, at some level, respect national sovereignty. And so what UNESCO did was they said, look, let's just draw a line. Anything, and the line is when this current decision that was ratified by the members of the United Nations, that any object after 1972 that enters your country, you have to be able to show that it was legally exported from its country of origin and legally imported into your country. And if you can meet that standard, then you can own it and display it in your museum. And it's not perfect. No one is saying it's perfect, but at least it's a reasonable thing. And we do have to respect, the laws of the time. And as it turns out, a lot of stuff you can clearly demonstrate it was stolen. Like a lot of things were the foreign troops in the Boxer Rebellion in China. They just looted the hell out of those places. Or in West Africa, there were all these Benin bronzes that were just plain stolen, and no one can dispute it. And people even wrote about it, right? So I would say it's a very slippery slope if you try to project it backwards and say, I don't care if it was legally exported in the 19th century. We want it back anyway. And so, I've had debates with James Cuno, who was at the time it was a workshop at the Joyce Foundation, and his own thinking has evolved a lot on that, and he is now a big proponent of cultural heritage. But working within that, we still have to respect the rule of law. At least I say we have to. I believe that that's the only ethically consistent way to do it. There are always going to be cases where something is very hinky. And there are examples where it's not just saying, well, we're going to project our ethics of 2020 back in time to the 1700s or something. That I think that's not right if the laws of the time said that. But the real question is, what do you do with looted antiquities where it's very hard to prove where they came from? And one example is there are these cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia that are unbelievable because they actually record the rations that were being paid to the king of Judea when he was being exiled after the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem. And it's like, oh yeah, that's, King, I forget if it's Jehoiakim or I forget the king's name, but his entourage of these elites from Judea were being deported to Babylon, and they're the records that show the rations that were being paid to them. And those clay tablets, they were looted in Iraq and smuggled out to the West. What do you do with them? You can't ignore them. They're totally unique objects. But those are the real ethical, for me, those are the real ethical problems, is how we deal with stuff like that. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but that's sort of how I personally feel about it. Just being really honest.
Yeah, I agree with you very, very strongly, but it is interesting that in the last 6 months, I have been reading more essays and hearing a lot more people now raise this question that it doesn't, that date doesn't matter, the documentation doesn't matter. But I personally do agree with you that at some point you have to say that those people were acting in good faith. So is that completely invalid now?
And they have
Thank you.
to be able to document it. That's the other thing. And you're right, it is an arbitrary line, but you have to start somewhere. That's all. So yeah, that's another 3-beer conversation. Yes, Penelope.
You talked about that one of your goals was education
Yes.
at several levels, and you talked more about education within the country of teaching the cultural heritage of those who are there, with partly an aim also of uniting people of disparate backgrounds within Afghanistan. I'm wondering what kind of education there might be, whether it's under your aegis or otherwise, of the other side of the equation, that is in Western countries. This seems to me, I'm thinking of Shoma's presentations with the nourishment projects. This seems to me antiquities and some of the amazing things that you just showed us images of seem to be right up there with dinosaurs in terms of being appealing to grammar school kids. And that part of the way you get people to care, I mean, that's an important issue. Do people on both sides of the equation of do they care about these? Do you have any idea what they are? Are they just old stuff? Maybe broken old stuff? I mean, who wants a statue with the nose missing? That kind of thing.
I do.
And I can just see kids. I mean, I'm thinking trading cards, collecting missing antiquities and things. But is there? You start with a third grader who becomes someone who, as an adult, cares about this. And I'm wondering what is happening with education at that level in Western countries.
I care about this stuff very deeply. I mean, I got interested in archaeology and decided I wanted to become an archaeologist when I was 10 or 11 years old. And I read God's Graves and Scholars. And then I got to go and visit Greece and see, the gold death mask of Agamemnon. There's something about, if you can reach children at that age of 10 or 11, they know enough to really put it together and to get it. And they also have at least some degree of idealism, and they're really smart and they're engaged. So it's a perfect age to reach people. And that's why I think it's very important to have some kind of heritage education. And usually it's going to be in terms of teaching people about the cultural heritage of their own country. So I think that's something that we really need to push for, that, who are we? Where do we come from? Why is this stuff uh, important. And if the key element, I think, is people have to be able to, when they look at an object in a museum or someone shows it to them, or they visit a heritage site, they have to be able to see themselves in that place, okay? To make a connection between themselves and what they're seeing and say, that's my history. That's where we come from as a country. That's the Liberty Bell, the real honest to God Liberty Bell. Or going to the Little Bighorn and seeing the battlefield there with Custer's Last Stand, or going to Gettysburg, which I think for most Americans, I've never been there and I
Oh,
really
go,
need to
go.
go. Because I've read so much about it, and seeing the Ken Burns thing, it's like something that every American can identify with. But if you teach people about that stuff, and you teach people about the archaeology of it or the history of it and the artifacts associated with it, in an age of fake news and alternate facts, it's very powerful and important to be able to say, I can prove it to you. I can prove there was a Holocaust. You can go there, you can see that stuff. So I think it's vital that we do that. We have the tools to do it. We have curricula that we can teach people. Museums have become very active in children's education for that reason. And I think some combination of museums and schools can make a big difference. And I'm telling you, these outreach things that we were doing in Afghanistan, it was so great seeing the interviews with these school kids, because they really got it and they were really interested. And it was a stunning thing for them. Like, just as an example, it's the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and that's not prescriptive, that's a description of reality. They're very, very religious Muslims. So to tell a group of Afghans in the Islamic Republic, did you know that your country was a Buddhist country for 1,000 years, Jack? And they say, no, that can't be. They say, well, yeah, I can show you. So it opens people's minds. It's a really good thing. And then if you can frame it, that's the real thing, is framing it so it makes sense to them, instead of them rejecting their past because it's Buddhist, to say, no, our country has always been a place of diverse religions and groups coming together. That's our history. That was it 1,000 years ago. That's who we are now. And that makes a difference. Yeah, let's see, Alan and then Samurai. Yeah, Alan?
Hi, Gil.
Hi.
First of all, that was spectacular, really, really fabulous.
Thank you.
I want to follow up a little bit on what Penelope was saying. COVID, of course, has really kind of knocked museums on their heads for quite some time. But are you planning, if and when it is possible, to have museums open and people coming in to do some exhibits based on what you've been doing?
Right now I'm just focusing on trying to get back to these places. But we're also, the Oriental Institute is, we would like to be able to bring some of those reassembled sculptures from Hada to the Oriental Institute. We just sort of cherry pick like 5 or 6 of the best ones. And we hope to bring them back. I've discussed it with the director of the National Museum, and he's very open to the idea of doing that. But I think it's something that we can really expand. That the rest of the world needs to know about this stuff, and I would like to have a role in it. I think it is doable. So I'm doing it by baby steps, though, I gotta admit.
As long as you're doing it. But I guess my concern is that for so many people who are not avid museum goers, museums are often seen as a kind of temples that are perfect and removed, and you go to see things. Even though we haven't used the velvet ropes for many, many years, many people still think that that's what a museum is.
Yeah.
What you're doing with this project is showing how alive and how significant and how much research comes out of museums and how much cultural heritage preservation is based in museums. And I think that it's a message. I mean, exhibits can convey information, but aside from conveying the information, they convey passion, or they can convey passion. And I think that if you can get the public to have a better understanding, both through education, as Penelope was suggesting, and also through an active exhibit program, ideally it's dimensional and it's not, just on a screen, because as you have said, and as we all know, there is something magical about the reality of something dimensional in front of you, especially if it's thousands of years old. But I think that in order to get the general public excited and aware of all of this, it requires a massive outreach, both in education and in museum exhibitry.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's hard to do. I think the hardest scientific writing, for instance, is writing for an educated lay public you have to assume that the people you're communicating with, there's intelligent people. They may not know the details of what you're telling them. That's why you're telling it to them, but they can definitely get it. If you phrase it in clear,
exactly,
intelligent English. And we all know who are like the writers, like Carl Sagan was brilliant at that kind of writing. And, there are a number of authors like that. So we have to get beyond the academic ease, which it's sad, but you get rewarded in graduate school for being incomprehensible, because if they can't understand you, it must mean you're smart, right? But it can be done. And I'm really inspired by this mobile museum project. I would like to see it as a kind of a two-way thing. Like, I'd like to try and, like with this center that we've just set up, I've said I want to try and take lessons from Afghanistan and mutatis mutandis, apply them in other countries. I know not everywhere in the world is Afghanistan, thank goodness. But suppose you could do these museum outreach programs where you bring 3D prints of artifacts so children can handle them, look at them, try and figure it out. It's a whole movement in museum education called object-based learning. So, okay, do something like that, and then have a flip side of it is if you can write grants where part of the funding is funding to pay for buses so that students can come in after they've seen the object, the replicas of the objects, and learned about them, they can actually come to the museum. Think of it as something that it's not a one-off program that you do in the school, but it's the beginning of a relationship that brings them to the museum. And once you get them in the door of that museum, they're really good public education departments in so many of the museums. The docents like you see at the Adler Planetarium, they're amazing, or at the Field Museum. These are smart people and they're good communicators. That's the kind of thing I would like to see expanded. And I'd like to try and I'd like to transpose this mobile museum project from Afghanistan and reestablish it in an evolved way in places like Uzbekistan, or Kazakhstan is another one where I'd like to try doing these things, because I know it can work under the right circumstances. So I'm really optimistic about it, and I think that this is key. You can change people's minds about stuff, and you can reach a critical mass where enough people value it and have learned it early on. Like people's awareness of environmental issues, that didn't come out of nowhere. It's come out of 10 or 15 years of kids in school learning about stuff like recycling and learning about pollution and doing the school science fair project on what happens if I put mercury into my little brother's drinking water. I'm not saying I did that, but
I used to break thermometers so that I could play with the mercury.
I'm glad you're still with us.
I am too.
But Gil, I think that the bus idea could work in Chicago.
Oh, it absolutely can. And we did have one of our volunteers, actually, like she gave a gift of like just a couple of $1,000s to fund buses because Chicago School District doesn't have the money. for just to bring the kids from, you know, western suburbs or wherever into the south side of Chicago. So it's funny how, in terms of return on investment, if you want to call it that, or bang for the buck, you really can do this. And I'm glad to, I think that the approach you're advocating is a good one. So let's see. Yeah, Alexander, and then someone else had their hand up. I'm not sure.
Great.
Gail, thank you. That was a fascinating presentation. I was just wondering, is there a relationship between the National Museum in Afghanistan and the museum in Peshawar? Because there's obviously a lot of material, particularly with the Gandharan
Yes.
sculptures. And in terms of rebuilding the collection and doing research into the material, are they connected?
You know, I wish I could say yes, but it's weird. I don't know if you know this concept of checkerboard alliances, like the black-white squares. So the Afghans and the Pakistanis hate each other. The Afghans very rightly view Pakistan as having totally messed up their political system. And it's sad, but they, on the other hand, the Afghans have wonderful relationships. So it just jump over Pakistan to India, and they have wonderful relations. And I know a lot of students I know have gone to graduate school in India, and then the Indian government has given them scholarships, stuff like that. But Peshawar is a tough nut to crack because it's Pashtuns on both sides of the border. I was talking about Bagram as the summer capital of the Kushan Empire. The winter capital was Taxila. So it's a natural thing. It would be totally logical, but the politics makes it very, very difficult to do that. For now, I would say as a longer term goal, it would be a very important thing to try to encourage. But
I'd heard that in Taxila and Mohenjo-daro, there was a lot of excavation that hasn't happened because it was essentially Buddhist. So there was less interest by the government to actually explore those sites. Is that the case with Taxila?
Taxila is, a lot of it is pre-Buddhist, but I think Taxila, I've never been there, but from my understanding is it has a magnificent museum. There's been a lot of excavation there, and Italian archaeologists are excavating a lot of other sites that are from that general period, even going into the Buddhist period, and they're okay with that. So it's complicated, but it's not. It's not that there's a denial of Buddhist history. It's just they have to figure out a way to express it, you know? And part of it is in Islam, you have this concept of Jahiliyyah, which means the period of ignorance before the revelation to Muhammad. And so they're okay with that stuff as long as you're not still worshiping it. And in fact, when the Taliban wanted to blow up the Bamiyan Buddhas, the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the leaders of Islamic theology went to the Taliban and said, these statues are not being worshipped, therefore they do not constitute idolatry, therefore you should not destroy them. And of course, the Taliban just blew them off and then they blew it up. So it's not impossible within Islamic theology. There is a place for Buddhist stuff. And I think that if you handle it sensitively, you can do it. So I'm optimistic, but you know. Merle?
Fabulous presentation. And thank you so much for all this work. I mean, it's so important. I want to take a slight detour though, in my question. The images you showed of the National Museum strike me that the building looks very European. And I'm just curious, because I've not been there, is that something that's typical, or was there a reason why it's an unusual architectural style?
That's a great question. And you're touching on one of my dreams, actually. It is Western style, absolutely. And it dates to the, I think 1919 or 1920. that there was the king of Afghanistan was a man named Amanullah. And you have to picture that this is the time, if you think across Eurasia, at the same time you had Kemal Ataturk westernizing Turkey, you had Reza Shah in Iran trying to westernize the country, and you had Amanullah trying to westernize Afghanistan.
Yeah, makes sense, yeah.
And so the whole neighborhood that the museum is in is called Darul Aman, which means the place of Amanullah, which was where he set up the administrative core of Kabul. And he was following European models and was trying to westernize. And his wife, Queen Soraya, she would like go around like with just like a flapper and wearing a mini skirt. And that really did not go over well. And it ended badly for Amanullah and his wife. But that's, you're completely right. That's where it stems from.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes, Soma. Am I pronouncing that right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. It's Shoma. I just,
Soma, okay.
to what Penelope had said, this is just for you, if you want to use it. Right in the backyard of your OI is the University of Chicago Charter School. And these are second, third graders that I teach with. And it might be interesting for your students in Afghanistan to know, these little children who are like 10, 11, 8, 9, 10, when they see Renaissance painting, so for example, Entombment by Michelangelo, what they learn is the blue color of the Virgin Mary's cloak. That lapis lazuli came from Sarasang mines in Afghanistan. So they understand that most of the Renaissance painting that are showing up in the museums would not exist had it not been for this area in the Middle East. So first of all, they learn to recognize where is this Afghanistan. Then they also grow further. So these are very little children. And I'll be happy to send you the pictures if you like.
Oh,
Then
cool.
they learn that they use the mercury there, you know, what they used, that the mercury, if you go the other way, if you go with the mercury, you can move with it. If you flow against the mercury, it's like moving an elephant, it's not going to happen. So you can bring in the geometry and the physics. So, but they learn through these. So the students you have in Afghanistan, they have a great deal of pride that many of the Renaissance painting would not exist had it not been for their country, because it comes from there. Kermi is all the color. And on the other end, the one that I'm doing with them now is their love of gardens. The Islamic gardens affected a ton of people, including Gertrude Jekyll, Lutyens in India. All of those Islamic gardens have a huge, what do you call them? Ripple effects in what we call gardeners. And the garden clubs across the world, sometimes you have to die to get a membership. It behooves, no, but it's sadly true. It behooves them well to know a lot of them come from areas that are war-torn, and they have heritages that are just staggeringly astounding.
You know, that, first of all, I love it that it's second and third graders who can really get it. And it
love
proves
it.
this idea.
I
Just
want the two
explain
of
it
you
to
to
them.
connect, so.
Sadly,
Well,
it's in your
give it on
backyard.
the emails.
What?
Sorry? I didn't hear the last thing you said.
They're in your backyard. Go meet them. The Tasha Bordestrasse from the Oriental Institute
Sure.
there.
I know Tasha.
She's told them stories about the Kandake and how the women there ruled power on their own. They didn't wait for inheriting power from others. And because they come from the Sudanese area, that the African heritage is extremely rich, very progressive. And so these children know about all these stories and they love it. So perhaps if you just tell the Afghanistan children that, look, you have all these little kids who absolutely think of your culture when they see a Renaissance painting. It
All
just
right,
shows they're not in the vacuum.
Then you're going to like this, because I didn't have time to mention it in my talk, but one of the things we're doing is there's this wonderful organization called the ACKU, the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, which was founded by Nancy Dupre, who is like the doyenne of Afghan cultural heritage. She was an amazing woman. So the ACKU has a literacy program around Afghanistan, where Nancy Dupre had the idea of having these like mobile libraries that would bring books to villages and towns all around the country. And it's been a highly successful program, more than 400 of these mobile libraries out there around the country. So one of the things we decided we would do is that we made an arrangement with them to publish 2 books for young readers or beginning readers about cultural heritage in Afghanistan. And these books they'll print up about 5,000 of them. They'll be in the mobile libraries and the rest they'll just distribute. And the idea is for the little kids, we wanted to have an idea where, we've made 3D prints of like 23 artifacts from the National Museum. So we told the authors, they're professional writers for the ACKU, will you write a story that builds around 1 or 2 of these artifacts? And it's a way for the kids to learn how to read, but also learn about their heritage at the same time. So the idea that they came up with was there's an Islamic capital called Ghazni, the Ghaznavid dynasty in southern Afghanistan that also ruled a big chunk of northern India. And Mahmud al-Ghazni, I think, is the one who destroyed the Hindu temple at Sarnath. Anyway, at Ghazni, they found this inscribed cup. And so we made a 3D print of it. And so this guy is going to write a book for young readers about a little village boy who finds a cup like this, and he shows it to his father, and his father says, oh, you have to bring it to the museum. And he brings it to the museum, and the kindly curator there translates the inscription for the kid. And then the kid goes home and he has all these dreams about, oh, what was life like 1,000 years ago, and things like that. So we're trying to do that as a way of reaching kids in that age group of beginning readers, to just get them acquainted with the idea of their own history and how they can reach back in time and see and experience their own history through these artifacts. So I'm very happy to hear about what you're doing.
I love that story. That's wonderful. Thank you.
You bet. Everyone talked out?
No, only beginning. We have to sleep on some of this. Gil, fantastic. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Barbara.
And you've got a group here. Some had to leave because of other appointments that just lap it up. The joy of having people such as yourself for 2 hours, and there are no competing kind of intellectual things, and we can concentrate. So it's one of the pleasures for me that I've kind of carved out of the virus, is being together with people and learning from people in a way that has a very special poignancy, but ability to concentrate and to learn. So thank you, sir.
It's a real silver lining, but I'd love to continue this conversation with any of you or all of you, because I mean, you can tell I'm like that guy who corners you at a party and starts telling you the answer to everything. It's magnesium, and but I'd love to keep talking with you. So Barbara, if anyone who wants, please.
And we would love you to come back. So
sure,
very, very much so.
Well, thanks very much. So take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, wonderful people.
Bye-bye, wonderful people.
Thank you. Bye.